Good afternoon. I am giving my presentation on considerations for ELL evaluation, and I'm Angela Peoples. The first question we're addressing is students may speak with dialects and differences related to their culture. How can these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language? One of the big things is there's such a difference in the languages. Like Black English is very prominent of the different dialects and that you'll hear. And a lot of times they will cut off ending sounds. They may change beginning sounds of words. So we have to be careful that when we're doing testing to watch for bias. If there is a test that you can see is going to lend itself to not being biased, you should eliminate that test altogether. If you can use informal procedures, that's the best way to do it. But a lot of times you can't because you want to get that comparative data. And so you need that norm group. So there's two options. You can get a whole new group of students and re-norm that test group, which is very expensive and not very practical to do. So the best option, what they say the gold standard option is to do two tests. Do one in the student's language, I should say the norm group, and get that score. And then the second test, consider the different ways that the speech is different. And then if they actually do answer those questions correctly based on the dialectal differences, then they should be scored correct on that. So then you'd have two different ways of scoring these students. What are some intervention options that are available to students who are English language learners if they need additional services? One of the big things I found out was that you can qualify, you can be an ELL and also qualify for special education services. In my personal life, I have a kiddo that is an ELL and also does struggle some. So that was real eye-opening to me because I thought maybe because he was in ELL, we couldn't even ask for him to get an evaluation for special education services. But there's a lot of things you can try to help students with. One thing I noticed was that you've got to check their, they might need glasses, they may need a hearing aid. These are simple health interventions that you can do to make sure that they're hearing correctly or seeing correctly. Those are the first steps to take. You can also use real life experiences when discussing reading materials or just teaching a lesson. Make sure you bring it to real life experiences. That helps students that are English language learners be able to learn easier. Provide more time for them to finish assignments because they're having to figure out these two different languages. It may take them longer to get done with an assignment. Also, a good idea is to pair an ELL student with an older or gifted, maybe same language speaking student to kind of be a student mentor toward that student. That can help a lot with their peer. There is some research on just peer interactions and how kids can really learn as they're helping another peer and vice versa. Make sure as a teacher that you're inviting that culture and that student's language in the classroom, that he doesn't feel so isolated, that he's having to learn the new language, plus he is in a totally different environment. So if you can bring some of that culture in the classroom, that's going to help kids do better with the interventions. Last, use a lot of manipulatives and hands-on material when you're teaching these students, so you can build that background knowledge that the kids are a lot of times lacking. I think this is great. You should do this for every student. And if it helps our students that are not having any difficulties with language, how much more should we use some of these manipulatives and the background, or help to build that background knowledge that's going to overall help them with their oral language development. So these are some practical ways. I think too, one of the big things I got out of the video that we watched was, if there's a plan in place, stick with it. Don't jump ship just because it's not working at the time. Give it time. Keep working that same system and you'll see results. But you've got to keep using the strategies that are in place for these students, because it's not helping when we just keep yanking them in different directions. Okay, moving on here. Why are students who are culturally and linguistically over-identified for special education services? One of the big things is, a lot of times the language deficiency is seen as a disability. They're struggling to learn, and what they say is a language difficulty and a disability can look similar. So you've got to be careful that we're not over-identifying these students that just need extra supports to learn the language. Not enough accurate tools, like we talked about even with the dialect earlier in my presentation. If we don't have the right tools to assess these kids, it's hard for us to get an accurate look at them. So we need better assessment tools for these students. And you would think we would be getting those just because we have so many ELL and English as a second language students. The inappropriate assessment instruments, and not, like we talked about before, not realizing that there are going to be differences in the way kids pronounce words, the phonological differences, the morpheme differences that they have found. It could be interrupted schooling. These kids have moved maybe in the middle of their school year, and that can interrupt learning and can cause them to look like they are far behind and maybe need special education services. A negative expectation. So often we can look down and have bias ourselves as teachers, and we can't look down on students just because they come from a different background that they aren't able to do this. We need to believe in every student. And then not appropriate instruction and cultural needs being met. There's not a lot. We need to have more Spanish-speaking teachers, bilingual teachers that can help to understand where these kids are coming from and be able to help them grow and not just qualify them for the special ed services or to be evaluated. Why are students who are culturally and linguistically under-identified for special education services? There can be under-identified. There's high rates of retention in some of these students because they're not understanding the language. So a lot of times it's seen as, oh, they just don't understand the language, but they really are struggling because they do have a disability that needs addressed. Again, some of these are similar. They're just like the opposite of over and under. The language differences look the same as a disability. We talked about that before. One thing that I thought was interesting is, as teachers they're discouraged to refer a student. They were saying, like, in some, it's an unwritten rule that you will wait at least 3 years before you would ever even think about having them be looked at for special education services. So sometimes they're under identified because they're leaning on the ELL, the language problem more, and really there is an actual learning disability that's there, but they're not being able to hear it or see it. Trying to learn English. I mean, these kids are trying to learn a new language. So like I talked about earlier, sometimes we can say, oh, it's just them trying to learn English and they're just struggling with it. It's really a balance. I find to, we don't want to just over-identify these students when they don't need that. They just need good teaching skills. They need hands-on manipulatives. They need to understand what they're learning through more concrete ways. And then rather than just identifying them for special ed, but also we don't want kids slipping through the cracks. And that's what's hard for me in this, is that there's that balance of, are they really struggling because they have a disability? So it's very tricky for us to work through this. But we honestly, when interventions aren't working, then there is a place to say, let's go ahead and see if there is some kind of disability that we can identify and get the help these kids need. Thank you, and have a great day.